He had not sought death. He had sought balance. Yet the longer justice was delayed, the more it festered, turning into something darker, colder, and irreversible. Every sound became a reminder. Every scent a wound reopened. Every gesture a weapon carved from memory. The years had stripped him of mercy, layer by layer, until only purpose remained. When the night finally came, it was not rage that guided his hand, but clarity. The clear, cruel knowledge that to restore the order of things, he must first destroy it. The world around him believed in laws and property, in names written on deeds and bloodlines, but he had learned that true law existed only in pain remembered and repaid. What he did that night was not murder. It was a return of balance in the only language the powerful understood. And when dawn came, nothing divine had changed, only men had. The river crawled to the lowlands like a vein of dull glass, its surface heavy with silt and silence. Morning fog drifted above the fields of Lavinia Hill Plantation, wrapping the rows of cotton in pale mist. The chapel bell rang from the courtyard, its hollow echo cutting through the damp air, summoning movement where sleep still clung to weary bodies. The first light of dawn revealed the order of the world, white columns, red soil, and black silhouettes bending to the rhythm of survival. Major Edmund Hale stood on the veranda, his uniform jacket hanging open, the brass buttons catching the faint light. His skin had the texture of weathered leather, and his gaze, cold and deliberate, swept across the land as if counting his dominion. He believed that fear was discipline, and that discipline was the only language that kept the earth in motion. Below him, Aaron moved with silent precision, issuing instructions to the workers, his voice steady, his eyes empty. The sound of shovels and footsteps merged with the low hum of insects, creating a monotonous hymn to labor. Inside the house, the air was thick with the sweetness of magnolia and the faint rot of humidity. Lila, graceful and careful, poured coffee into fine porcelain embossed with the family crest. The lace tablecloth gleamed white as bone under the morning light. Mrs. Clara Hale sat upright, every motion polished, her beauty as cold as the marble mantel behind her. The scent of vanilla candles mingled with the musty odor of the river, blending comfort and decay into a single breath. Through the tall windows, the breeze carried the echo of the bell, lifting the curtains like restless ghosts. The day began as all others had, precise and rehearsed, yet somewhere beyond the edge of the plantation, a quiet current was shifting beneath the calm. The wind touched the water, and the river seemed to whisper a promise of change, though no one yet heard it. The morning light entered the dining room through the tall shutters, slicing the air into narrow, golden bars. Outside, the winter sun burned weakly over the Louisiana fields, its warmth fading before it reached the veranda. Inside, everything smelled of polish and control. Beeswax on the floors, coffee brewing in the silver pot, perfume lingering on the edges of the mistress's silk sleeves. Lila moved carefully, her steps soft, her hands trembling only slightly as she poured the dark liquid into porcelain cups. She kept her eyes low, watching the thin wisp of steam twist upward like a fragile prayer. Across the table, Mrs. Clara Hale turned the pages of her French fashion magazine, the delicate rustle of paper filling the silence like the hiss of a snake. The Major sat at the head of the table, his shoulders straight, his presence heavy. When he reached the sugar bowl, his elbow brushed the pot. The movement was small, almost invisible, but the effect was immediate. The scalding coffee spilled across the white lace, blooming into a dark, spreading stain. For a moment, no one moved. The smell of burnt sugar and wet linen filled the air. The ticking of the mantel clock grew louder, marking each second like a heartbeat. Clara lifted her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on the servant before her. The room seemed to shrink around Lila, the air thinning until every breath felt like a confession. The silence carried its own verdict long before any words were spoken. In that stillness, guilt shifted soundlessly from a man who caused the accent to the woman who could not defend herself. When the day faded into red over the distant cotton fields, the house stood quiet once more. Only the faint mark remained on the tablecloth, dark and irreversible, and somewhere in the fading light, a body lay still while another continued to breathe without life. For 3 nights the house breathed in whispers and candle smoke. Lila lay upon the narrow bed, her body still but her eyes open, their light dimming slowly. like a river losing the sun. The air in the cabin smelled of fever and damp linen, the faint sweetness of crushed herbs that could not heal what had already left her. Aaron sat beside her, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his chest. He counted the seconds between her shallow breaths, each one slower than the last. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves of the willow by the stream, a soft murmur that sounded almost like prayer. When she finally spoke, her voice came from a place already beyond reach. The sound was barely more than air, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. He leaned close, his hand brushing her cold cheek, and her eyes met his with a strange calmness. Then silence. Her chest did not rise again. The candle at her bedside flickered, struggled, and went out, leaving the room in the kind of darkness that makes memory sharper than sight. Aaron sat there long after the body cooled, his hands folded over hers, feeling the faint outline of the small iron ring he had forged for her years ago from an old horseshoe. It had always been too large for her finger, but she wore it with pride, calling it her heart in iron. He slid it free with care, held it between his palms as if it might burn him, and whispered her name though no one could hear. Before dawn, he dug a grave beneath the willow, the earth wet and heavy, the roots winding through the soil like veins. He placed her there without witness, marked the spot with single smooth stone, and pressed the ring into bark above her head. When the sun rose, the world resumed its order. The bell rang, the overseers shouted, the work began. Aaron walked among them as always, his face calm, his steps measured. But the light in his eyes had vanished, leaving only the quiet steadiness of a man who had nothing left to lose. The days that followed moved with the precision of ritual, silent and slow, as if the air itself feared to disturb the balance of the house. The plantation breathed through habit, not life. Aaron woke before dawn, his body obeying the same rhythm it always had, his hands performing tasks they no longer felt. He spoke little, answered when spoken to, and carried out orders with mechanical grace. The overseers laughed at their own cruelty, testing him with just meant to reopen wounds. But his face never changed. They called him steady, obedient, reliable, the kind of man who had learned to forget. Even Clara noticed. From her parlor window, she watched him move through the courtyard, his back straight, his steps measured, and she felt a quiet satisfaction, mistaking control for peace. Inside, the house preparations began for the Christmas feast. The rooms filled with movement and perfume, the scent of roasted meat mingling with pine resin and candle wax. Aaron worked among the decorations, repairing what others had broken, adjusting what others ignored. He climbed a ladder in the grand dining room, tightening the brass fixtures of the chandelier, while music from the piano floated faintly through the hall. Each crystal piece reflected his face in fragments, scattering it across the ceiling like 1,000 ghostly witnesses. When he descended, he tested the edge of the carving knife, its steel glinting like a sliver of winter light. The table was nearly complete, a masterpiece of order and wealth. White linen stretched perfectly across the mahogany surface, silver polished until it caught fire from the candle flames, glass shimmering with deep red wine from the year 1838. Every plate bore the family crest, each placement precise as a soldier's formation. Aaron slipped the knife beneath the folds of the cloth near the head of the table, his movements smooth, unhurried, invisible. Around him a house pulsed with anticipation, the servants whispering, the piano continuing its cheerful waltz. But beneath the glittering surface, something vast and patient waited. The air felt too clean, the light too bright, as if the walls themselves sensed that the evening would demand a reckoning. And in the stillness before the feast, the house held its breath, unaware that the man who moved so quietly among them was no longer serving. It was only pretending. The dining room shimmered with light and noise, a portrait of wealth painted in gold and crimson. The scent of roasted meat and pine filled the air, mingling with laughter that rang too loudly against the high ceiling. Candles burned in long rows, their flames mirrored in crystal glasses brimming with dark wine. Clara lifted her glass with a polished smile, her pearls catching the glow. The words she spoke hung in the air like a charm meant to protect the house from its own sins. But at that precise moment, a draft slipped through the open corridor. The flame nearest the door bent once, flickered and died. Others followed, one after another, until half the room sank into shadow. The guests turned their heads, with the cold wind, subtle at first, then heavy, sharp, alive. When Aaron stepped through the doorway, the silence became complete. His face was unreadable, his posture unhurried, his step steady on the marble floor. In his hands he carried the major's rifle, held with the same ease he once held shovel. The light caught the steel barrel, and in its reflection the whole room seemed smaller. No one spoke. Time folded into itself, shrinking to the sound of his breath and the soft groan of the floor beneath his boots. He moved ahead of the table, the same place where Edmund Hale had once sat in judgment over others. The major half rose from his chair, his movements uncertain, the bravado draining from his face. Aaron's gaze silenced him more effectively than words. The air itself seemed to solidify, trapping every person in that room like insects preserved in amber. The rifle did not waver. The candles flickered violently, shadows dancing across the portraits of long-dead ancestors that lined the walls. Their painted eyes seemed to watch, unblinking, as order reversed itself. Aaron spoke quietly, each word deliberate, his voice steady, stripped of emotion. He did not shout, did not tremble. He spoke as if delivering a benediction for the dead. His words fell like the tolling of a slow bell, measured, inevitable. The people at the table obeyed without question, their fine clothes brushing against the edge of terror. He gestured for them to sit, and they did, their bodies rigid, their hands trembling in their laps. The feast before them, meat, bread, wine, silver, had become an altar. Aaron reached for one of the porcelain plates, the same pattern Lila had once handled with careful reverence, and dropped it to the floor. The shatter rang out like thunder. He took the decanter wine, poured it slowly across the white cloth, watching the red liquid spread, blooming into a stain that devoured everything in its path. The silence deepened, every eye fixed on the expanding mark. It was not wine anymore. It was memory made visible. He looked down at it, his voice low and final. What had once been obedience had turned into judgment. What had once been submission had become truth. The room seemed to lean toward him, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. When the rifle finally fired, the report shook the air, rattling the chandelier, sending ripples through the candles. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the house itself inhaled the sound, and then exhaled as a long, shuddering sigh that carried the weight of all that had been silenced for too long. The morning broke pale and cold, the mist rising from the river and curling around the white pillars of the house like smoke from a dying fire. The servants approached slowly, their footsteps hesitant, afraid of what silence might conceal. The front door stood open, swinging gently in the wind, creaking as though the house itself still breathed. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder and wax. The great dining room lay in ruin, shattered glass on the floor, overturned chairs, the long table stained a deep, unyielding red. The candles had burned down to puddles of wax, their light long extinguished. Major Hale sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed forward as if in prayer, but his eyes were fixed and empty. Beside him, Clara still lived, her face drained of color, her hand clutching a broken rosary, its beads scattered across the floor like tiny black seeds. No sound came from her lips, only a faint tremor that rippled through her fingers. Aaron was gone. No trace of him remained inside the house, no footprints on the veranda, no sign of flight in the damp earth. Yet behind the stables, where the willow bent low toward the stream, the ground was freshly turned. The soil there was soft and dark, the imprint of his hand still faintly visible. Above the mound, a single branch bore a small iron ring that glinted weakly in the morning light. It hung there motionless, catching the breeze that carried the scent of river water and ash. In the weeks that followed, the story spread faster than the winter storms. Some said he had fled into the swamps, where no white man dared to go. Others swore he had been seen at dusk near the cypress groves, watching from the shadows. Rumors took shape and hardened into legend. The man who vanished into the wilderness, carrying the memory of the dead and the weight of the living. They whispered that he avenged those who could not speak, that his footsteps echoed through the marsh when injustice was near. In hidden prayer circles and abandoned churches, his name became a promise murmured in candlelight. When they prayed, they spoke of him not as a man, but as a force that refused to fade. They said that when everything was taken, Memory was the last weapon, and when memory grew stronger than fear, it became freedom itself. Years later, each Christmas night, people came quietly to the willow by the stream. They placed small candles at its roots, their flames trembling in the wind. In the dark windows of Delta City, those flames reflected faintly, flickering like the heartbeat of something that would not die. A reminder of the man named Aaron, who once chose to stop being a shadow and became the voice of every silence left behind.